Hi everybody, I want to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about cell membrane structure and function. So what is a cell membrane made of and what does it do? So this slide has a list of the plasma membrane, another word for the cell membrane, functions. So the first is physical isolation. It physically isolates the cell from the surrounding environment. It also regulates what can come in and come out of the cell, and what can enter the cell from the external environment. So a cell in your body is bathed in what's called interstitial fluid, and that interstitial fluid has a different component than the fluid inside your cells, and that's because the cell regulates that exchange of things like sodium and potassium, and other ions like chloride. The cell membrane also is involved in how a cell can sense its environment. So there's all kinds of receptors, usually proteins, on the surface of a cell membrane. And sometimes these receptors have pockets that can bind molecules in the external environment, and those can elicit some kind of cellular change, and the cell can respond to those things in the environment. Some examples of that are hormones. Hormones from your blood can bind to receptors on the surface of a cell and tell that cell to do something. They're signals. Grow, divide, activate some enzymes. Also, there's all kinds of receptors that allow cells to recognize one another. All of our immune cells have tons and tons of surface receptors that allow them to recognize other cells in your bodies and potential pathogens. The cell membrane is also structural support. It physically links to different proteins in your cytoskeleton, and provides some of the overall structure and framework of the cell, and can change as the cytoskeleton changes in shape. So in general, we have lipids and proteins, phospholipids, and this lipid bilayer prevents most molecules, like charged molecules, polar molecules, from passing through the cell. So anything that's not very good at passing through lipids doesn't really enter the cell very readily, unless there's a specific protein that allows that material to come through. So for example, water is a polar molecule, so most water has to move through aquaporin channels in the cell membrane. Sodium and potassium are positively charged cations, and so ions have to travel through protein channels or transporters. They can't directly pass through the cell membrane. Things that can pass directly through a cell membrane are things that are hydrophobic, so things that are lipid-like in nature. Steroids, other lipids, and then sometimes small nonpolar molecules like carbon dioxide and oxygen can pass through the cell membrane as well, the lipid bilayer. So our cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. So you remember, lipids are one of our major macromolecule groups, and phospholipids are a type of lipid. They have this 3-carbon glycerol backbone, and they're similar to things like fats, which also have that glycerol 3-carbon backbone. And so a fat like a triglyceride would have 3 fatty acids hanging off that glycerol backbone. A phospholipid's a little different in that it has this phosphate group on one of those carbons instead of a third fatty acid. And it still has 2 hydrophobic fatty acids hanging off this this glycerol backbone. So that phosphate group is charged, and what ends up happening is this head of this molecule, it ends up being water-loving or hydrophilic, and the tails end up being water-fearing or hydrophobic. And so if you get these phospholipids and you put them in an aqueous solution, so you put them in water, they tend to start to form structures kind of like this, where the hydrophilic heads arrange towards the outside on both sides, and then the tails point inward, the hydrophobic tails point inward. So you get this phospholipid bilayer, and this is what cell membranes are composed of, a phospholipid bilayer. So this, in this case, this is the extracellular side and the intracellular side. Now, in the cell membrane is not just phospholipids, not just a phospholipid bilayer. There are proteins, and by weight, cell membrane is about 50% protein, roughly 50% protein and 50% phospholipids. And you can see there's lots of different kinds of proteins embedded or stuck to this membrane. You can take a look at in your book and on the slide here, different kinds of proteins. So I mentioned receptors before. They bind extracellular things, and then those can cause changes inside the cell. There are things that stuff inside the cell can anchor to. There are channels. So you can see in this one there's a pore that might allow some kind of molecule like glucose or potassium or sodium to travel through. So cell membranes are made of phospholipid bilayer and proteins, and lots of different kinds of proteins. And then the third component is cholesterol, and you can see the cholesterol kind of is inserted between some of these phospholipid molecules. So cholesterol is this carbon, these are carbon rings here. So cholesterol looks similar to steroids when you learned about steroids, because most steroid hormones are made from cholesterol. You get cholesterol in your diet. And so you just need to know that cholesterol is a component of cell membranes, and it is involved in changing membrane fluidity and permeability. So cholesterol affects membrane permeability, so how readily things pass through it, and its fluidity, how easily these molecules move around within this sort of fluid mosaic of proteins and phospholipids.